people are really good at knowing what doesn't work for them. They're good at articulating what their problems are and their frustrations. As designers and founders and product people, it is our job to help solve them for them. It's not their job to tell us how to solve their problems.
Hey everyone, welcome to Bright and Early, the podcast for people building early stage startups. I'm your host, Brian Ray. I talk to entrepreneurs, product people, designers, and marketing pros about their experiences during the early days to help you feel just a little less crazy. My guest today is Andrea Hill. Andrea is a UX researcher and product strategist. She has led innovation efforts at companies like LexisNexis, ReadyTalk, and through her own consultancy, Frameplay. Next up for her is a fellowship with Code for Canada, where she'll be embedded within a division of the government of Canada for 10 months. So listen, if you've got a complex problem in need of an elegant solution, Andrea is someone you want to listen to. Andrea, welcome to Bright and Early.
Hey, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure. So we originally met at a Denver startup week several years ago, talking about jobs to be done. I think is that
I think that is correct. Yes.
It's been really fun staying in touch. And so you're up in Canada now.
I am. I moved up here about 15 months ago, right in the middle of February, which is not something I would necessarily advise to anyone, but got a chance to explore Canadian winter. So moved from Denver up to Ottawa, Canada. And now I'm really excited to be really entrenched in that and kicking off some work with the government up here.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear a lot more about that. First, I want to ask you though, you are quite the distance runner.
I am. I didn't run here though. I didn't run all the way from Denver. I did fly.
That would have been super impressive. You do like serious distances, but have you ever done one of those insane like ultras, 100-miler craziness? I haven't done anything that far. The furthest I've gone at one time is 50 kilometers, which is about 32 miles. That being said, at once, I did do something a couple of years ago around Lake Tahoe. Which was about 80 miles over 3 days. So it was 3 marathons in 3 days. Goodness. And you just finished a race like not long ago. I feel like I saw on Twitter, right?
I did. A local community here had a few races on Sunday. So they had a 5-mile race at 8 a.m. A 10-mile race at 8 a.m. And then at 10:10, they started a 5-mile race. So I jumped into both of those in preparation for the Ottawa Marathon that's coming up here in about 2 weeks.
That'll be fun. Can I work in a strained metaphor here about how growing a business is more like a marathon than a 5K? Is that too much?
I think you can. I think you can work that in.
Yeah. Do you find yourself, in all seriousness, thinking through problems as you run? Is that a process for you?
Absolutely. So running is actually a great place for me to be thinking through things. And sometimes that is listening to podcasts, to be completely honest. That's where I get a lot of my podcast listening in, because when you're out there on a weekend for 2-3 hours, kind of alone to your own thoughts, sometimes you don't want to be alone to those thoughts. So I'll use that for kind of some educational time or reflection. I have been known to stop a run and jot something down in Evernote and just kind of process through things. So I find it's a really great opportunity for me to kind of take a step back from the desk. I think sometimes we think that we have to always be sitting somewhere and maniacally producing to make gains. And for me, that taking that step away from sitting at the computer and manically doing something can be a way to kind of give yourself the space and time to process through and think things through.
What are some of the podcasts that you tend to listen to on your runs?
I listen to Masters of Scale by Reid Hoffman.
Yeah.
if you haven't listened to that one before, they do some interesting like audio and sound effects that kind of keep you engaged over the run. One that they've just spun off for Masters of Scale is something called Should This Exist? And I think it's incredibly timely.
I haven't heard of that one. What's it about?
Yeah. So the premise is a founder with an idea will come on and talk about his idea. And then they'll have two experts kind of give pros and cons of the potential ethics or the ramifications to society or kind of maybe the parts that the founder doesn't necessarily want to think about. And so it's almost a philosophical, there are benefits to this thing, but what else should we consider when this comes out to the world? So I've actually only listened to one episode thus far, but it was a pretty interesting one because I think it's really easy for us to get excited about our ideas and want to push them forward. And this is sort of a little bit of a cautionary kind of, let's make sure we're thinking about the potential less than stellar aspects of our ideas.
That's interesting. Should this exist in the sense of what is this going to do for society? Not should this exist as in, is there a sustainable business here?
Correct.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay. I gotta check that out. And I've seen you tweeting about, is it Montero, Mike Montero? How do you pronounce his last name? I've only ever read it.
I don't know.
Okay. But anyway,
Montero.
I'll link to it in the show notes, and so that our pronunciations can be botched here. But I've seen you tweeting about his new book.
Mm-hmm, that's right. Ruined by Design. If you haven't heard of it, you will now. Now that we've mentioned it, you'll see it everywhere. But it came out probably within the last few months. We're recording this in May 2019. And there's a few aspects of it. So one is this notion of the responsibility we have to take as designers. So it can seem, we might get caught up in thinking that we're doing something that's very innocuous, but the fact is there can be implications, and any decision we make, we have to take responsibility for kind of the things that filter out of that. So he raises some challenges. It's really a book about ethics, and there's a call to action to almost create kind of a Hippocratic oath for designers. Mm-hmm. And I want to pause here and say, before everyone hangs up and says, I thought this was for founders, not for designers. The notion of a designer is really, anyone who brings something into the world. And so as you are designing your company, you are designing a product. These are all, this notion of creativity or creation and design are kind of intermingled. And so there's just kind of this notion of, even if you have good intent, you're ultimately responsible for how that gets used in the world. And he rags on Twitter a bunch. It's just half the book is just making fun of Twitter, and questioning some of the decisions they've made or decisions they've chosen not to make. So if you're offended by the F word, you might have a problem with this book, but it was...
Or Mike Montero in general.
That is true. But it was an interesting book to reflect on the role that you're playing as you're kind of bringing something into the world.
I was going to ask that, the obvious examples are Facebook and Twitter. Most people shouldn't think or expect that they're going to create the next Facebook or Twitter. And so does he give other examples of maybe smaller or less impactful companies that should have been more thoughtful or mindful in the early stages about what sort of impact is this going to have on society or on the people who use this thing?
Offhand, I don't know that I can think of kind of a smaller company that he pulls up to discuss, but one example that he pulls out very early that was very impactful was Volkswagen. So we all know that Volkswagen wasn't exactly straightforward and honest in their emissions testing.
Yep.
And I say we all know, maybe we don't. So Volkswagen was charged with kind of misleading folks on their emissions testing. And basically what happened is the cars were designed such that when you run an emissions test, it filters it really well. When you are not running that specific emissions test, all of a sudden the emissions aren't filtered quite as well. And so it was designed.
Yeah, somebody built that.
To mislead that. And so, and that person has actually been charged and I believe went to jail. And so that was kind of the case that he says, someone made that decision and someone wrote that code and someone implemented that. Like that was an intentional choice. And now we're seeing people that have to pay the price. And so it's sort of that question of at what point do you take responsibility for what you're doing? Maybe it wasn't that programmer's decision to do it. It wasn't his idea, but the fact is he implemented it and now he's in jail. And so just kind of that notion of, do we need a board of ethics? Do we need a licensing? Do we need an oath that says we will, not do harm unto others? Because once upon a time, maybe the projects we worked on weren't impactful, but now these do have the potential to impact people's lives. And so do we have to take some ownership and responsibility of the potential impact we could have?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, especially at the founder level. I mean, you're talking about, we're talking now about programming and things that have made it out into the world as part of that product. This is not just accessibility or anything like that. Those are decisions that founders need to think about.
And I would say there's probably, and I don't recall if it's in his book or something else I've read recently, really that question of the business model. When all is said and done, someone is going to be paying. And so is that your customers paying out of pocket? Are you selling their data? Are you expecting a big company is going to buy you out? Because in that case, you still need something to sell. And so really being conscious up front to think about that and consider it and figure out where your own personal line is, because one day you are going to have to figure it out. And so it really doesn't do you a lot of good to start without having an idea of eventually how is this thing going to be a business and not a hobby.
Yeah. And ultimately what impact is it going to have on the people who use it and the people around the people who use it. So I'm really curious how you're taking this line of thought into your Code for Canada fellowship. Can you talk to us a little bit more in detail about the fellowship and what that's going to be like?
Certainly. So I have a background in private enterprise. So I have worked for a lot of for-profit companies making software, and this fellowship with the government is actually going to be really exciting, and I'm excited to kind of make this shift. The purpose is to take professionals who have worked in the digital space and kind of embed them into government agencies. So kind of bring in additional capacity and potentially some different skills to kind of shake things up and help them work in a more agile, design thinking sort of way. So I'm going to be working with Public Services and Procurement Canada, which is kind of the backbone of the federal government, in reimagining the government travel experience. So I am sure we've all got some travel horror stories, and especially if you've ever traveled for work, kind of the question of how do I schedule this? How do I book it? How do I pay for it? How do I do expenses? All these sorts of things. And we've seen those for our individual companies. Now imagine that you've got 300,000 federal employees that are trying to travel. And so the fellowship or the initiative I'll be working on is helping to try to boil that ocean. In the course of 9 months. How do we identify where are the gaps in that process? Where is it falling down? How can we have the most impact? And really the goal is within that 9 months to do early upfront research, prototype, test with users, and I think ideally have something out within the next year for public servants to be able to use to improve their travel experience.
Okay. Yeah. So this is why I wanted to have you on to talk through this. There's a show for early stage founders, and so the government of Canada is not exactly an early stage company. Fair.
That's fair to say.
But your background at it's been as an entrepreneur running innovation teams within companies. So how how are you thinking about, well, and let me say, many founders are rightly looking out into the world at extremely complex problems with 800-pound gorillas running the market. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get in there and tackle this problem in a nimble way that's going to have major impact? All right. And so that's the connection that I would love to draw and think about and talk through here, is that you're kind of you're coming in as, as you just kind of described, trying to take a more agile approach to solving this problem. So from that point of view, can you talk about your process for understanding and tackling a ridiculously complex problem with a small team?
Absolutely. So they always say that the best way to eat an 800-pound elephant is one bite at a time. And I actually had this conversation with someone just this morning of, well, if we have a limited period of time. And I have no doubt that people have thought about this problem before. It's not like this issue just arose. And so there might be a sense of, there's so much information we could get. There's so many places we could start. How do we do anything? How do we move forward? And I think we're at a really unique place right now where we're starting to feel that tension of, do you build for a big market? Do you build for the generic user? Or do you go after a specific niche? And I think I actually think that my answer might be different than what I would advise people listening to this podcast.
Why is that?
Because I would generally say, if you're starting something new, you should go niche.
Yeah.
I would say you should have an idea, absolutely, that there is a large market potential. You don't want to be so niche that you're capping your potential growth. But I would tend to say, to start out with, you want to be very specific and very focused, and make sure that you are solving something that is very important for a limited group of people.
Build something small, simple, and great for those small number of people, and make it work. And then add one layer of complexity, and then one layer of complexity, so that it works along the way. Is that what you're envisioning?
Exactly.
Okay. And so, go ahead.
Right. And so the only reason why I would say I might have to take a bit of a different approach is just by virtue of, given the size and scope of the audience. Like, usually an early stage company will want to start with a small, if you look at the diffusion of innovation and you start with your early adopters, you want to have those passionate early adopters, and then over time grow that group. And then I'm drawing that little bell curve design. Do you know the one I'm talking about? The diffusion of innovation. Okay.
Yep. I'll link to it.
Problem with a podcast, right?
Yeah.
So you start with a smaller group, and then over time you can grow that. And as more people start to adopt your product, they're going to have slightly different needs. They're going to have different levels of tolerance for how rough this thing is, or how much they need to duct tape it together. And I feel as though the project that I'm going to be taking on might be almost a little bit later. Now I'm going to talk myself out of this. See, I should have probably planned this before we got on the phone.
Oh no,
this is out of that, because
this is great. I mean, this is what this process actually looks like: is thinking through something, poking holes in it yourself, reconvincing yourself of your position. Yeah. So go ahead.
For sure. This might be a little bit closer to a founder who's maybe trying to enter a market that there's already incumbents. So there's already something out there. There's already, an example, for lack of a better one, I guess it's a pretty good one, is Slack, right?
Yeah.
When Slack first came out, people were like, certain people were like, that's just IRC. That's existed already. Like, why are we making such a big deal about this? That technology already exists. And the fact is, well, yeah, the technology existed, but there were only a certain type of people who were willing to go to the efforts to use it. Mm-hmm. And so Slack came in. The idea was, the concept was proven, and they were able to hit a larger target market because of the experience ultimately, right? Like the market and aligned with the experience, and they were able to kind of capture a big piece. So at this point, I'm going to say that the Code for Canada work is exactly aligned because we have to come into something that people are going to be able to adopt relatively quickly. We don't want to have that 2 years of runway of establishing a market because we just don't have it. And so we don't want to be too early on the far side of those early adopters where we say something and people have the majority of people have no concept of how important it is or why they would need it, because we don't want to have to establish that category.
Yeah. Yeah. You've already got, there's already an early majority and late majority of people using the thing that you need to improve upon.
Yes, absolutely. They recognize that they've got a problem. And so it's a little bit easier to sell them a solution than really kind of make them recognize that they have a problem.
Mm-hmm. So,
all right. So should we go back to your original question?
Well, okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to the original question. This is an extremely complex problem. And so if a founder approaching a complex issue with deeply entrenched incumbents, their options are to find a very narrow niche of customers and make them ridiculously happy, and then kind of land and expand from there. Or how would you summarize the alternative, which is the position that it seems like you're in, where you actually need to, within your first couple of offerings, provide a solution that's going to satisfy even late adopters and laggards?
Perfect. Yeah. So I think that there's a couple levers there. So one is the one you mentioned, which is the lever of there's a customer segment that is not currently having their needs met. And so if we go after that niche, they're hungry for a solution. We can focus in on their needs and we're off to the races. The alternative is to take a little bit more of a product-centric approach and look at, well, if we look at the solutions right now, and the experience that folks are going through right now, where are the opportunities within that they're kind of struggling? And so you and I, obviously both jobs to be done aficionados, for lack of a better word. So I would almost look at something like the universal job map. And so what is the process that people are going through this experience, and where are they struggling? Mm-hmm. So that could be a journey map, which is like, what are they doing right now? And where are the highs and lows from their different touch points? Or it could be at a high level, what would you hope to see happen at this point? What are your considerations while you're doing your booking? What are the things that are working for you? Where are things going wrong? What is the point in this? What at this step are you struggling with? And really use that to hone in and say, oh, it turns out that it's the moment that people are collecting their receipts to submit that is time consuming, leads to error, drives people crazy, all those sorts of things. And so you can kind of look at, there's already existing people doing this process, but this is where the process is broken. And that can be the opportunity to really zing in and iterate and improve on that piece.
Hey friends, this is a great time to pause and let you know that Bright and Early is brought to you by Transistor.fm. Transistor offers you professional podcast hosting and analytics. They host this very podcast that you're listening to right now. And my friends, I got to tell you, it could not be easier. I can tell you from personal experience. As you also probably know, podcasting is becoming one of the best ways to develop a closer relationship with your audience. And so if you're thinking about starting a podcast, trust me, look no further. Just visit transistor.fm, and if you decide to sign up, let them know that Brian sent you. Yeah, exactly. And you've got an advantage there in that you're going to have access to a bunch of folks, And I mean, thinking about the diffusion of innovation, often the late majority, and even the early majority, it's not that they don't want a better solution. They're just hesitant to adopt even a better thing. And so if what you're able to discover is you can design a better product or design a better offering by digging into those processes that you were just talking about, finding the pieces of it that are overly complex, designing a better solution that's more human friendly. There's no reason why the majority of the curve won't adopt it sooner, especially if you've got the levers of the people who can make that happen.
Right. One thing I'm really excited about is, because of the fact that this process already exists, we are going to be able to do more like contextual inquiry. We're going to be able to watch people do this. It's not going to be an abstract, what would you do? Or it doesn't have to be a conversation where people are explicitly telling us what they think they would do. We're going to actually be able to observe that. And that's a piece of research that I really love, is the being able to kind of passively observe thing and notice the issues and notice the challenges that people have that are almost, they've got their own workarounds, or they've got their own, they accept it. So they're not going to complain about it. If there's something that takes me a period of time and I just think that that's how it is, it's not going to occur to me that it could be better. And those are the problems that I love to solve for customers. The ones where no one even asks you. So I've kind of always had this perspective when it comes to product and design, that if someone asks you for a feature, you will never actually be able to solve them, because the minute you give them the feature they asked for, they will say, why didn't I have it sooner? Like, it's kind of a losing battle. Whereas if you give someone something that will solve a problem that they never asked for, that's where you're going to get the delight.
Yeah.
Because they didn't even have expectations. So not only did you meet them, you blew them out of the water. And so for me, being able to spend that time observing someone and seeing what are the words they use when they describe something, or what are the steps that they struggle with, those are the things that are just super, like, you can't put a price on them. And so that would be something I would advise every founder, even if you have a great idea, even if you're very confident you know what to solve, that time with customers, put that time in, because especially early on, those are going to be the rich insights that are really going to help drive what you're doing. And those will be the people that you're solving problems for. So I would say that time spent with the people who are eventually going to benefit from whatever you're building is invaluable.
I think what's interesting about what you're saying there is you're threading this needle between oh gosh, let me get this right. You're threading this needle between not talking to don't talk to customers, ask them for the features that they want and build that exact thing. That will not lead to success. And the other end of the spectrum of, customers don't really know what it is that they want. And so you need to be the genius solo founder who hacks away at something in the basement and then reveals it to a world who wants it in some Jobsian, here's your iPhone fashion. Does that make sense? You're talking about this middle ground of don't listen to people verbatim and go recreate those features. Understand what's underneath it. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes.
So can you,
yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. So customers, people, I hate saying customers or clients because it infers that, well, I mean, I do, but it kind of infers that they're paying us money and that's why they're valuable. They're actually human beings. So people are really good at knowing what doesn't work for them. They're good at articulating what their problems are and their frustrations. It is our job as designers and founders and product people to help create things, to solve those problems. Oh man, I wish I'd said that a little bit more soundbitey. Not upped in the middle of it, but that's all right. So people are really good at knowing what their problems are. It is our job to help solve them for them.
Yeah.
It's not their job to tell us how to solve their problems. And so, that's tough. It's really easy when someone starts to tell you their problem for them to want to also say, if you just put 3 more buttons, that would solve my problem.
Yeah.
But again, it should be our, that's why we do what we do to help solve problems. It should be on us to kind of help understand the best way to do that. And we can also do that by coming up with lots of individual data points, learning from a lot of people, and then coming up with the solutions that's going to solve it for a larger group.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
and then testing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the soundbitey version of that, I think that I've heard is people are experts in their problems, not the solutions to those problems, which is where, design comes in, business design, product design, UX design, the whole thing there. Are there times though that you think that just the eureka moment of thinking through a solution without a defensible amount of customer insight or customer input is valid?
I think it absolutely can be. There's some really smart people out there, and every experience we've ever had collates itself in our brain, right? So you might wake up tomorrow morning with this amazing idea, and you might think it doesn't come from a person who told you that. But for all we know, it was your grandma Sue 3 years ago who said us something, and it just happened to make that connection in your brain. So, I think that those things are absolutely possible. Mm-hmm. I would recommend that your next step would be to go out and kind of test the waters with it. I wouldn't
validate it a little bit. Yeah.
I wouldn't say go and build it for the next 2 months.
Yeah.
2 months. That would be, the next 12 months. But I think that absolutely, if those ideas come to you, that's a great time to say, well, let's kick this around. I don't think that we should necessarily throw ideas out just because we didn't talk to a person yesterday and come up with the idea today.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the, let's just change course a little bit here and just think generally, because you've worked in a number of different settings and have seen enough founders and people getting ideas off the ground in the very early stages, and have done that work yourself, of course. What are some common mistakes that you see founders make in the very early stages of building and nurturing an idea or a company?
I think one of the biggest challenges we can have is solving a problem that's not critical, or solving a problem that people don't actually want to be solved. And so an example I have for that is a few years ago, I was working for a web conferencing company, and we were toying around with this idea that when someone ran a webinar afterwards, we were going to we were going to do AI, Brian. We were going to auto create video clips. So it would actually be a perfect example for what we're doing right now. You and I are going to have this conversation, and the notion was at the end of it, it would snap our little sound bites, and then you would not have to spend time editing. We would already have these sound bites. And this was this internal idea. We thought, this is great. It's going to save our customers so much time. Who doesn't want time saved? Like, this is fantastic. And we got all excited about it. And then my team kind of said, well, let's just wait. Let's just chat with a couple people and just make sure. And it turned out, for our use case, which was people who are paid to run webinars, it turns out that that's actually the part of their job that they really love. They loved the notion of going through it and finding those pieces. And they were worried about making sure that it was snipped correctly and that it had the right feel. And so there was a sense of, well, you're taking away the part of my job that I actually love. Whereas from our outside perspective, we thought, oh, we'll just save them time. Doesn't everyone want saved time? And we didn't realize that they actually had other values in play. So I think for me, it's making sure that you're solving a problem that your customer really wants to have solved.
Mm-hmm. And solving the right part of the problem in the right way. There's that, the thing. Yeah, if you're taking the joy out of it for them, even if that is something that they run up against, and it does take them time. If you take joy out of that piece of the job, that's no fun.
Yep. Now, this is a weird example, and it kind of becomes a philosophical question a little bit. I would guess that if we had talked to maybe their bosses might have been fine with the idea, right? Because unfortunately, if the boss cares more about speed and money, at this point, this, automating this person's job away might still seem like a good idea. Mm-hmm. Which kind of comes down to that question again, like, what's your goal for your company? Who are you serving? Are you serving people who make webinars, or are you serving marketing managers who want to cut costs? And that's kind of a decision for you to make, because any idea can be applied at a number of different levels.
Interesting. Andrea, we only have a couple of minutes left here. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I could go on for another 40 minutes. So I think we should meet back up at a later time, because I was really fascinated in the way that you think through these problems, like the philosophical aspect as a designer. So one of my last thoughts, or last question I'd like to ask you is just around the idea of maintaining sanity, calmness, and peace of mind as you're working on a startup, early stage company. It can get to be a little bit nuts if you don't actively work to maintain, sanity. So I'm curious if there are any practices that you have found helpful that you would like to share.
So we already talked a little bit about running. That's a big one for me, to kind of separate myself, making sure that I'm getting time outside in nature. That is surprisingly rejuvenating, to just kind of take a step back and realize, as much as these things can seem crazy and like life consuming, and the weight of the world is on your shoulders, while you're still in Colorado, I think, go outside and take a look at a mountain, and you get a little bit of perspective back.
Yeah.
And for me, that's always been a way to kind of take a step back and say, all right, we'll work our way through this. And then I would say another thing that I try to do almost every day is journal. Mm-hmm. So there's this thing called morning pages. And the idea is you get up and kind of first thing in the morning, you just jot longhand 3 pages of whatever's on your mind. And for me, that's been a really nice way to kind of get the day going, get kind of those niggling things that are in the back of my head out onto paper. And then I can figure out if I'm going to deal with them today or I'm not. But at the very least, it kind of helps clear my head a little bit. I don't do it every day, but it's definitely something that I try to do. And especially when I find I'm getting overwhelmed, just that little, I think it takes about 20 minutes, can be a really good way to kind of wake up and get focused before jumping into whatever else I have to do.
My guest today has been Andrea Hill. You can find her on Twitter and Medium at AF Hill. Andrea, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me today.
Thanks so much, Brian. It was great to talk to you.
Okie dokie. Got my coffee and some notes. Let's do some closing thoughts. It's funny, when we ended that call, Andrea kind of laughed and was like, we covered a lot of topics. Was that any good? I thought it was awesome. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Particularly just the whole conversation around the ethics of design, the ethics of the business model. I think that's just like becoming more and more pertinent, as it's how Andrea was pointing it out. The work that a lot of us, that a lot of us have the opportunity to be investing our time and our skills and our efforts into, can have, seriously large impacts. And so I think it's important just to be aware, even on the business model design, side of things.
what's your revenue model, and what are the impacts of that going to be? I'll say, yeah, I'll go ahead and go into this. As I've been working on building my own audience, growing this podcast, pretty much every bit of audience building, community building advice that I have come across always includes start a Facebook group. And I'm not going to get on a soapbox. I'm not going to go on a rant. I am just going to state the fact that for myself, I deleted my Facebook account in January of 2018, and I don't miss it. And I noticed I noticed a lot of yeah, there were good things about that for me. And so running ads on that platform in order to send traffic to my properties is not something that I'm going to do. And I am certain that there's probably a cost to that. It costs a lot more to run ads on Google than it does on Facebook, and which is okay, which is a separate topic. I'm sure a few of you just shouted at your at your podcast player there. You can't not run ads on Facebook and then run them on Google. Fair enough. Reach out to me and explain to me why. I truly would love to have that conversation. And so, anyway, so outside of that, like, which businesses are you going to support? Who are you going to do business with? The other side of that is, how are people going to do business with you? And what are the effects of your business? And there's certainly the thing about, wanting to, what's the goal is to increase engagement, to create a sticky product for people to log into your thing all the time. I think the question needs to be asked as you're doing that. Are you increasing engagement because it's such a useful thing and people can't imagine running their business without your product? I would describe Trello that way for myself. I spend a lot of time in Trello every single day I'm at work because it's just so useful for me. It's just the way that my brain works. Like, it works for me in a whole lot of ways. I don't spend a lot of time in Trello because I'm addicted to it, or because I'm just checking it obsessively, the way that I definitely feel myself doing with Twitter, and I try to keep that try to keep that manageable. And for sure, the sort of thing I noticed about myself with Facebook and Instagram. I didn't mention this. I also have deleted my Instagram account. Well, that's not true. I didn't delete it. I've just deleted it from my phone, and I never log into it anymore. And so I think you're probably, hopefully I'm explaining this well, and you might be nodding along with that distinction between creating something that is extremely useful to somebody, to your customers, so useful that they are highly engaged and spend a whole lot of time with it, versus trying to, induce little drops of dopamine along the way so that people are constantly just, spending and, flittering away their minutes and hours in a day using your thing. I think that's all very, very fascinating. Found it interesting to hear Andrea, this expert in innovation and innovation design, to hear her talk about how she and her team are facing a design challenge that's more along the lines of like an agency level redesign with this existing suboptimal solution. And there's going to be a list of requirements that likely aren't up necessarily for negotiation to some degree. But if you're a startup going after a deep, an incumbent, then it's all up for negotiation. Like, all the requirements are on the table because you're creating something new. So through customer research and interviews, you might come to some provocative solution that says, yeah, hey, we're going to cut out about a third of what you might have called table stakes features. We're going to offer less. We're going to underdo the incumbents on purpose because we think, for the most part, that's like cruft and feature creep. that has just worked its way in over the past, 8 to 10 years. And then you get to test that hypothesis and see if you can win within your niche and then expand from there. That's just the way that innovation goes. And so I just really enjoyed, thinking through and talking through that with Andrea. I'll be very fascinated to see what hopefully she is able to write and share a bunch of this stuff as she goes along, or certainly down the road when there are things to share. But I mean, major takeaway, like put the time in with your customers. Qualitative insights are just absolutely invaluable. We talked about it a bit. Customers are experts in their problems, not the solutions. And so don't ask, if we built X feature, would you use it? That is a question in customer research that can lead you down the wrong trail. Don't ask, if we built this, would you use it? And don't solve problems that aren't critical. There are some problems that are in fact problems, but people will not break their habits in order to get them solved. They just won't. So here's how you can suss that out. Because if you pitch a solution and then ask, hey, if I built this, will you buy it? Or say, hey, if we added X to the product, do you think you would use it? People will say yes for a number of reasons, but for starters, they'll say yes to spare your feelings. And some people will be blatantly obvious or blatantly honest. Most people won't. Most people will say yes to your face and lie to your face, or even lie over email if there's any kind of a relationship, just to spare your feelings. And besides that, even if they are honest, people are too optimistic about their willingness to alter their behavior, or break their habits. And so it may be legit. Oh yes, I really would. I would want to do that. That is a better way to go about it. But when the rubber meets the road, just think about your own decision making. And how many times have you said, "Oh, no, I know I need to do this differently, but gosh, whatever. I want to get this done." You don't have the energy to learn something new or to try something new, even if you know over the long haul there will be a benefit. That is just not the way most people operate. And so, if you observe someone struggling with a problem and you think you might be able to, that you think you could solve, you just pursue a line of questioning like, hey, it looks like you're dealing with a problem there. It looks like this piece of the workflow is inefficient, or you're frustrated here. So how often would you say that happens? And then you can let them give you a factual historical answer. And so what happens if you don't resolve that, or if it takes a while for you to resolve it? How do you usually solve that? And what else have you tried? So think about those things. Like, how often does that happen? It happens every single day. Well, what happens if you don't resolve that, or if it takes a long time? Actually, it's kind of not that big of a deal. I'll either just tell the intern to do it, or between you and me, nothing really happens if I don't do this. Okay, cool. End of discussion. That is not an actual problem. That's an inconvenience. Or how often does that happen? All the time. What happens if you don't resolve that? Well, we won't get these payments filled, and we get charged a $25 late fee. Sometimes we pay it. Sometimes we're able to push back. But there's a late fee. Oh, okay. Well, how do you usually solve that? Well, I put a reminder for myself, or like I said, we can contact the vendor and get the $25 fee back. It just kind of depends. But you can see the difference when you ask questions that are about how often does this happen? What happens if it doesn't get solved? And what have you tried? How do you usually solve it? Those things are not this emotional, objective, hey, would you buy this if I built it? Or if we added this, would that be helpful? That's the way you can kind of dig in there and suss that out. So, goodness, what else? I could probably go on for another 15 minutes about that episode, but we'll pause it there. I would love to hear what you all think. You can go to brightandearlypodcast.com. by the way. I don't think I've been pushing that quite enough. It's about a couple people sign up over there. So brightandearlypodcast.com, where you can add yourself to the newsletter, or just, stay up on some things. Or you can, of course, reach out to me on Twitter. I am B-Ray, B-R-H-E-A, as in barefoot, runner, hills, endurance, and aerobic. Thanks for listening.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Listen, if you dig this show and you want to hear more, then please head on over to Apple Podcasts or Google Play and leave a review. It really is the best way to help other people find the show, which is great for my guests, which is great for the show, which then makes it easier to attract more guests. You see where this is going. So if you're listening and you think other folks should be, please leave a review. And if not for me, then do it for the extremely cool group of people who've agreed to be the first guests on my show, knowing that it's brand new with very little to offer them. Jane Portman, Claire Solentraub, Gia Lottie, Margaret Kelsey, Janelle Allen, Andrea Hill, and by the time you hear this, plenty more. These are all really busy people who already have an audience of their own and were so gracious to me when I said, hey, I'm launching a brand new podcast with no listeners, and here's what it's about. Are you game? And they said yes. So if not for me, do it for them. Leave a review, tell a friend, spread the word. And until next time, I'm Brian Ray.